Nirasya sarva sandeham akikritya sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami gurumishwaram itam Sri Radhika Nata Pada Sarojayo yena premanubhutyasya dattam tam Shri Gurum Bhaje Shri Govinda Pararavinda Marupananyabhinasojita. Pardon me. Shri Govinda Pararavinda Marupananyabhinashojitan Purna Prema Rasotsavu Jalamano Vritti Prasannananan Shashvad Krishna Katha Mahamrita Payorasho Murakelato Vande Bhagavatani Mananudabam Murna Nipatyakshito Namah Shri Guru Krishnaya Nirupadi Kripa Krite Yena Shri Chaitanya Rupa Bhut Tanvan Prema Rasam Kalo Jayatam Sarito Pangor Mama Mandamater Gati Matsarvasva Parambojo Radha Madana Mohano Adadana-strinam dantoir yacheham puna puna Srimad Rupa Parambojo Dhyudi Syam Janma Janmani Abhirapali Patiputra Kanta Dasya Bilashati Balashvavara Shri Rupa Chintamali Sapti Sangsto Matsvanta Durdhanta Haichurastam Raganugami Bhajano Lasamanasanam Shri Radhaya Sahasara Smaratam Brajendhum Shri Rupa Pada Kamala Shrita Cheta Samme Chittam Satam Madhukari Yatu Pada Padme Bhaktir ya nikilartha varga janani shrut ya brahma sakshat kriter anandati shaya prada vishayajat sukyat vimuktir yaya Shri Radha Ramanam Padam Vajayugam Yasya Mahanashrayo Yakarya Vrajalokavat Gurutara Premnaiva Tasyai Namah Yaram ya nikila ghashanga shamani shrutra tritim sangata Ya swadhya rasikai sukabdi janani dhikarya mukti spriham Ya dhyata hridaye vrajendra tanuja premamrita syandini Saji Yadhari Bhakta Vrinda Mohita Dhanye Padyavali. So, by the grace of Shri Kali Yuga Pavana, the Svabhajana Vibhajana, Prayojana Avatar Prema Purushottam Karuna Mahasagar Shri Gauranga Mahaprabhu and his beloved Parshad, the Chris Jewel of Gaudiya Vaishnavacharyas, the fulfiller of his heart's desire on this earth, Sri Rupa Gosvami Pad. Again today we will continue our discussion of Padyavali. And in particular we resume in our discussion of the final verse in the section on Sotsukya Prarthana, or prayers full of eagerness, namely the fourth verse of the Shikshastakam. And we're continuing our crunching, if you will, of the nitty-gritty when it comes to Niskama-bhakti, desiring bhakti, not desiring things other than bhakti, desiring Bhagavan, desiring service to Bhagavan, how the desire for bhakti, the desire for Bhagavan, for darshan of Bhagavan, for the service to Bhagavan are all integrated into the unit of that which is to be desired. And as Mahaprabhu put it, wealth and followers and poeticism and other things are not to be desired. So in our last discussion, we began this analysis of Vritrasura's statements to Indra, how Indra, even having been told by Bhagavan directly that he better not desire the death of Vritrasura, even after directly being advised by Bhagavan himself, Indra still desired this. So we looked at why that is, why people commit sin even when they know better, as per an analysis in the Gita, how a state of delusion sets in such that people act against their own best understanding or their knowledge of their own best interest, under the pressure or the influence of the desires that pervade their psyche. So today we'll go further into this same subject and look at what plays out here in this account in the Bhagavatam of Indra and Vritrasura, and what also we can learn from it in regard to how to aspire to Ahaituki-bhakti or Niskama-bhakti as aspirants on this path of Uttama-bhakti. So I'll start from the middle of the previous file. I think it's page 6 or 7 in the PDF. So just after the commentary of Sridhar Samipad on Bhagavad Gita 262-263, where we left off last time, I'm starting from there. So, Sri Chakravarti Pad and Sri Baladibhushan Pad, in their discussion of the aforecited statements of Bhagavan Sri Krishna in Sri Gita, also refer to a teaching in Srimad Bhagavatam spoken by Maharaj Yayati to his wife Devayani, after the long-lived king at last realized that he could never satiate the kama in his mind, no matter how many resources he amassed and how long he immersed himself in acts of enjoyment. So I won't go into the whole narration here, but in short, this king, by the allowance of his own son and the arrangement of the devas, is enabled to live an extremely prolonged life in the midst of all varieties of royal pleasure. So after spending a long time attempting to fulfill his material desires with more than ample facility to do so, then what conclusion did he reach? So this is a very significant point for personal reflection regarding the nature of material pleasure and material desire. So it says, Yat pritibhyam brihiyavam hiranyam pashava striyaha na dhuyanti mana pritim pungsam kama hatasyate na jatu kama kamanam upabhogena shamyati havisha krishna vartmena bhuya eva vivardate ya dustaja durmati bhir jiryato ya najiryati tam trishnam dukam nirvaham sharma kamo drutam tyajet. So he says, all the rice, barley, gold, animals, and women on earth cannot satisfy the mind of a man afflicted with kama. And we can substitute that for, AI and, whatever your favorite currency is, and, a credit card with an unlimited balance and whatever. In other words, all the things that are thought to be the means to fulfilling all of one's desires. He's saying all of that in the world combined, even if it was at your disposal, will not satiate the desire that one has in the mind. Why not? Kama is never extinguished by enjoyment of objects of kama. It is only again further increased thereby, like a fire by oblations. One who has an interest in well-being should swiftly shun that constant, or you could render it as extreme or invariable bearer of miseries, desire, which is difficult to shun for the ill-minded, and which does not age as a result of aging. Meaning, which even the destroyer of everything, time, is not a cause of destruction of. Meaning someone's body, someone's endeavors, someone's health, etc. may all deteriorate with time, but in even an old, decrepit body, still the desire burns as strong as it did in youth. There's this saying, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Meaning the desire still burns, but now we just don't have the ability to fulfill it. So, what he wants to say, and what's significant from the context, is that he's not just theorizing this, but he's, as per the narrative in the Bhagavatam, had as good of an opportunity as anyone could have had. Because we find that oftentimes people might think, oh, if I had more money, if I had a better looking body, if I had more social status, if I had this, if I had that, then I would be happy, then I would fulfill my desires. I just need this other thing, and then I would be happy. But then the people who have that, they want something else. The people who have that, they want something else. And so he who had everything that you could want in essentially inexhaustible measure, he realized still, even when you have all of that, you just keep wanting more and more and more and more and more. So you're never going to satiate this thing called kama. So you can't hope that it'll just leave you automatically. Okay, I give you what you want, go home. You know, the way some person might come to a king and say, oh, please, we have this problem, and then the king solves the problem, and then they go live happy with their family on their farm or whatever. Kama is not like that. It's just going to keep coming back again and again and again and again. So there's no real benefit in merely placating it. Rather, he's saying one should swiftly shun the constant or invariable cause of misery, desire. So in other words, one has to overcome this. That's why the Gita uses the language of enemy, that this is the eternal enemy. This is the thing which has to be battled, which has to be somehow overcome in order to achieve something higher, something greater. So this is cited by Chakravarti Pad in his comments on those statements in the Gita, which speak about desire as the, quote, enemy. So, in light of this explanation of Kama's influence, it can be understood that although Indra received instruction from Bhagavan himself in the aforesaid verses from Srimad Bhagavatam regarding the insubstantiality of objects of the senses, and thus the impossibility of ever feeling complete satisfaction by means of enjoying them, Indra, under the influence of Kama, the influence of his desire for wealth, power, and enjoyment, was bereft of discernment and remembrance of what he had been taught, and thus remained intent upon seeking the destruction of his perceived enemy Vritra, who, unbeknownst to Indra, was actually a great bhakta of Bhagavan, actually had no enmity towards Indra at all, and had only been reborn from the son of a Brahmana, associated with the Asura clan, as a result of a curse he received in a previous life. So in other words, Indra is deluded by his desires, intent upon killing someone who actually has no enmity or desire to take his position or anything at all. So what's significant here is how desire creates delusion, essentially, or someone repeatedly goes on fostering something that actually causes them suffering, but all the while keeps thinking, no, this will produce happiness. I think there's a quote of Einstein where he's saying, to do something repeatedly and expect it suddenly to produce a different result, something like this he defines as insanity. So to think that you'll keep on pursuing material desires and that someday after fulfilling them you'll really be completely satisfied, that would fit, this analysis of desire in the Bhagavatam would fit Einstein's definition of insanity. So thus, Krishna himself describes it as a state of delusion that one enters. And one, or most, or I, you can feel this in your own, thoughts and the way things unfold inside your own mind. You can see how you can feel the presence of desires for things in yourself that by your own cool, discerning analysis are actually useless or detrimental, and yet just by knowing that, or even just by analyzing that, doesn't immediately stop them from arising. And so the Bhagavatam is showing that Bhagavan is well aware of this condition, that the conditioning of the jivas results in such. Bhagavan is well acquainted with this, as here Indra himself, much less any ordinary human beings, are doing that very thing right in front of him. So, when Indra later challenged Vritra to a duel, Vritra first advised Indra to forgo his vain pursuit of perpetual rule and enjoyment in Svarga, explaining that such attainments are not at all indications of Bhagavan's grace upon a bhakta. So these come from these celebrated statements in the 6th canto. Pungsang kilai kanta diyam swakanam yasam paro divibhumo rasayam narati advesha udvegadhir mada kadir vyasanam samprayasa trivargikayasa vighatam asmad patir vidate purushasya shakra tato numeo bhagavat prasado yodur labo kinchana gocharunyai. To persons of one-pointed mind who are his own, Bhagavan certainly does not bestow the riches which are found in heaven, on earth, or in rasa, and from which enmity, fear, anxiety, conceit, quarrel, plight, and exertion ensue. In other words, what's wrong with having a bunch of money and a bunch of wealth and a bunch of status? In a nutshell, this is what's wrong. When you have those things, whether you like it or not, enmity will be fostered by people towards you just because you have those things. You'll typically feel fear that you'll lose them. You'll feel anxiety regarding, as a result of that fear, there'll be a tendency to become conceited or proud about having those things. You'll end up in quarrels with people who foster enmity against you. You'll end up in trouble because of those people's, quarreling or pursuing their, making pursuits to acquire things from you. And exertion. You'll spend a bunch of your time just maintaining what you have. So just by having these things, there's no guarantee that you actually are satisfied. As much as you possessions possess you. And when you have a lot of them, then they take up a lot of your time to protect them, preserve them, etc. So he's saying that Bhagavan, he never gives people who are his own, people who he really wants to favor with the best thing, he doesn't give them things that result in them just getting constantly mentally and physically absorbed in sustaining things that don't directly relate to him. So, O Indra, O Master, our Master, what does he do instead? Administers impediments to a person's endeavors relating to Trivarga. And from that is to be inferred Bhagavan's grace, which is perceptible to the divested, but for others is difficult to grasp. In other words, it's not Bhagavan's grace upon you that you're killing me and you're attaining Svarga. That's actually the opposite. That if Bhagavan were to obstruct you from achieving this, that would have been a bigger blessing upon you. But since you're not divested, since you're not detached, you don't understand, Bhagavan's actual grace is only perceptible to those who are detached or of purified mind. So Chakravartipad has some nice commentary on these verses which illuminates this whole dynamic. I'll just read the translation. So he says, "Listen, O Indra," this is as though Vritra is saying, "You are a bhakta of my Prabhu, and I too am a bhakta of Prabhu." Okay, we're both bhaktas of the same Bhagavan. In that, however, he bestows enjoyment and opulence only upon you, and not rather upon me. Okay, we're both bhaktas, we both have the same Bhagavan, but he's giving you one thing and me something else. So why? Why is the same Bhagavan giving his two bhaktas two different things? Hear of the reason for this, that is, of the disposition of my Prabhu. He does not bestow those riches upon persons who are of one-pointed mind upon him. Why? Because such riches are those riches from which enmity and so forth, that is, distractions from the joy of bhakti ensue. So this is a nice way of putting it. You might say, what's wrong with having a whole bunch of wealth and money and status? That's all pleasurable. Okay, maybe it is pleasurable in the material sense. But because it's pleasurable in the material sense, it's going to cause you to do what? Feel that pleasure. And by feeling that pleasure, you're not feeling the pleasure of bhakti. You're getting absorbed in another type of pleasure, and that's the whole problem. If you're someone who's detached, if you're someone whose desire is only bhakti, desire is only Bhagavan, for that person it's a problem. If you don't really want bhakti, then sure, be happy with that. So Bhagavan does not bestow these distractions from the joy of bhakti upon those who are one-pointed upon him. He administers rather impediments to those endeavors relating to the Trivarga, that is, those the object of which is dharma, artha, and kama. From that, meaning specifically from that continuance of a person's, that is his own intimate bhakta's endeavor relating to the Trivarga, discontinuance, Bhagavan's grace is to be inferred. In other words, if grace comes upon a bhakta such that they become disinterested in pursuing things of the world and only interested in engaging in bhakti, then that person got blessed. Not that the person who got a bunch of wealth and status in the world is the one who got favored by Bhagavan. The opposite. Indra replies, well, on the contrary, that does not appear so to be so in our experience. Well, I don't agree with you. I think it is Bhagavan's grace that I get to be the king of Svarga and have this beautiful pleasure garden and have all this power and all these things. So, he doesn't agree. To this, Vritrasura says that grace is perceptible only to the divested. That is, those who have no desire for anything other than bhakti to Bhagavan. But difficult to grasp for others like you, meaning it is indeed imperceptible to you. So Indra, you don't agree with me? Of course you don't. You don't get it. You can't see this. Therefore, because of an absence of Bhagavan's full grace upon you, you will attain riches. Being confident of this, quickly hurl the thunderbolt you have brought here with you to kill me. So okay, I tried, I explained it to you, but your mind is not pure enough to understand what I'm saying, so there's no point in belaboring the topic, just kill me, let's get on with it. So just see how, fearless Vritrasura was, and how fixed he was in his convictions. Seeing Indra nevertheless not hurling the thunderbolt, Vritrasura thought, Hanta, what can I say to this pitiful foe, an external seer? That is, person whose vision is fixed only upon superficial externality. Why don't I appeal to the lotus feet of my own Prabhu? In other words, why should I waste time talking to this guy? He's not going to get it anyway, and he's still not even willing to kill me. So let me just turn my mind back to Bhagavan. Seeing Bhagavan then become visible in his meditation, he says aham. That is, he speaks the following verses. So he says, aham hare tava paraikamula dasanudaso bhavitasmi bhuya manas marita supater gunangste grinita vakarma karutukaya nanaka prishtam na chaparameshtyam na sarvabhumam na rasadipatyam na yoga siddhira punarbhuvam va samanjasatva virahaya kangshe. O Hari, may I again become a lowly servant of those servants of yours, whose sole shelter is your feet. May my mind remember you, the sustainer of my pranas, my speech sing of your qualities, and my body perform service to you. Neither the vault of heaven, nor the position of the highest standing, nor rule over the entirety of the earth, nor sovereignty over rasa, nor the yoga siddhis, nor non-repetition of birth do I desire. O proper one, or O treasure of all fortune, I leaving you. So he's saying, other than you, I don't want anything. I just want that my body, my mind, my words, they may be engaged in your service. So Chakravarti Pad comments on this as follows. After Vritra prays to become a lowly servant and engaged accordingly with his mind, speech and body in Sri Bhagavan's service, in verse 24, Bhagavan says, well, I will certainly give you all rewards, svarga, liberation, and so on, accept them. So it's as though Vritrasura is telling Indra, this isn't Bhagavan's grace upon you that you're getting all this. And he turns to Bhagavan, I just want to, with my mind, body, and words, serve you as the servant of your servant. And then Bhagavan, maybe tongue-in-cheek, right, says, why not? Here, you can go to Svarga for a while and then take moksha. Don't you want those things? So Vritrasura's reply, the Chakravarti Pad, makes it a little colorful. With his head shaking, no. Vritrasura says, nanaka prishtam. In other words, this repeated negation all throughout the verse. We had the same parallel verse spoken by the Nagapatnis in the last reading of the Sharanagati Prakaran and Hari Bhakti Vilas, almost identical statement. So the repeated, instances of negation, Chakravarti Pad is adding the color to that he's saying, nanaka prishtam nachapara meshtam. It's like, no. So leaving you, that is in separation from you, my pranas are burning. How will Svarga and so forth bring me any happiness? So this is a strong way of putting it. So he's drawing this because in the earlier statement, he described Bhagavan to Indra, as Ashupati. So Ashu is a synonym for prana. So pranapati or prananath is the way that he's addressing Bhagavan in this case. So here, to me it appears that Chakravarti Pad is drawing out this subtlety from that previous way of invoking the name of Bhagavan in the context. So by saying, my pranas are burning, the implication is he had just described Bhagavan as the Lord of his pranas, the source of his peace and sustenance and life air. And then, to say, I'm in this state of being deprived of you, of your companionship, of your service. So if you're the sustainer of my pranas, then without you, they're not being sustained. So what are they doing? They're burning. In other words, I feel as though my pranas are going to be lost, or they're in a state of distress. So the only thing that will protect them, the only thing that will sustain them is he whose function is that. In other words, is you. You are the Lord of my heart, nothing else. So none of these other things will bring me any happiness. So happiness is subjective to the psychological conditioning that we have. For someone, they go to Svarga and it's happy. For another person, it's miserable. It's the same place, same ambrosia, same music, same gardens, etc. But very different experience because the person has a different desire. They have a different outlook. They have a different way that their mind is attuned. So for Vritrasura, he's saying, I'll never feel any pleasure in Svarga. And Indra is thinking, Svarga is exactly where I want to be. What greater pleasure could there be than that? So the very same thing they have opposite attitudes about because of their underlying desire. So this whole subject matter is, throughout this verse and verse 4 of the Shikshastakam, this whole analysis is to show how pervasively influential the desire that we foster is and the underlying vasanas, samskaras that we have, how this really shapes and colors the entirety of our experience of life and our environment and our relationships and everything. So to refine that is, the most powerful, significant, and beneficial thing that one can do. So he adds, let me have the 3 boons stated in the previous verse in direct connection with you. Then that itself will be for me the greatest happiness in comparison to everything, svarga, liberation, and so forth. Therefore, what is the use of accepting those things? There is none. Saying, nothing will satisfy me except service to you. So Mahaprabhu is saying, I want Ahaituki-bhakti, I don't want anything else. So this is the same thread. Vritrasura's resolute statement in the aforecited verse of non-ambition for svarga and so forth closely resembles the first half of the verse under discussion, where Sriman Mahaprabhu similarly resolutely states his non-ambition for wealth, people, beautiful women, and poeticism, using the negative particle na repeatedly before all the objects being negated. Since Sri Jivapad emphasizes in Priti Sandarbha that pure Priti for Sri Bhagavan is observable in these statements of Vritra, it can be understood that pure bhakti is prayed for and emphasized in the verse under discussion by Sriman Mahaprabhu. Furthermore, the import is that the sadhana explained earlier in the Shikshastakam, by way of the glorification of Nama Sankirtan in the opening verse, and the explanation of the qualities with which Nama Sankirtan is to be performed in the 3rd verse, can only be accomplished in an ideal manner when one has purified the psyche of all desires other than the desire for bhakti, as was discussed earlier with reference to the seminal definition of Uttama-bhakti given at the outset of Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. So I'm coming back to this point because it's the heart of the whole matter, and giving another point from the Sindhu itself that further fortifies this understanding. This same principle is also made even more vividly evident by Sri Rupa Pad when he defines sadhana bhakti in Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. So kriti sadhya bhavat sadhya sacha sadhana bhida. That aspect of Uttama-bhakti, which is to be accomplished by action of the senses, and the aim of which is bhava-bhakti, shall be known as sadhana bhakti. Specifically noteworthy in this regard is sadhana bhakti's characteristic of being, quote, that the aim of which is bhava. So there's 2 elements. Sadhana, how is sadhana defined? It's defined as something that's accomplished with the senses. That's one characteristic. And it's defined as that the aim of which is bhava. This is a second characteristic. So we're going to just focus on the second characteristic in this discussion. So, relatedly, Sri Jivapad has explained in his commentary on Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu 1.341, as was cited earlier in the commentary on verse 83, that the primary characteristic of bhava bhakti is, quote, desirousness solely of him alone, tadeka sprihatvam eva. Thus, to say that sadhana bhakti is that the aim of which is bhava, essentially means that the aim and success of sadhana bhakti is to reach a state in which one's psyche becomes possessed of, quote, desirousness solely of Bhagavan alone, tadeka sprihatvam. So if the goal of sadhana is bhav, and the primary characteristic of bhav is desiring nothing but Bhagavan, then what are you doing when you're doing sadhana bhakti? You're doing that the aim of which is reaching a state of mind in which you desire nothing other than Bhagavan. If you put these 2 points together, this is the outcome. So this becomes a very powerful guiding principle. So then what sadhana bhakti am I performing? And is it successfully leading to that? Is it bringing me closer to achieving this goal? The goal of sadhana is bhav. Sadhana is successful when someone achieves bhav. Sadhana is not successful when someone doesn't achieve bhav. Whatever one is doing, it's valuable to the extent that it leads to the accomplishment of the goal. The goal is to reach the state of desirousness solely of Him. So is whatever I'm doing in the name of sadhana bhakti leading to that or not leading to that? This is something through introspection one can gradually understand and then attempt to adjust accordingly. Sriman Mahaprabhu's prayer in the verse under discussion, which negates desire for all other objects and expresses desire only for causeless bhakti, that is for bhakti free from desire for any extraneous object, thus epitomizes the essential aim and aspiration of sadhana bhakti itself, and thereby of every aspirant striving to follow the path of sadhana bhakti. So to be a sadhaka is to have the desire described in this fourth verse of the Shikshastakam, in essence. So now we'll look at it from another perspective and say, but is these other desires, these other things, what's so bad about them? Are they really so problematic? So the deleterious effects of fostering desires for objects other than Bhagavan and bhakti to him, while engaging in sadhana bhakti, is vividly illustrated by Sriman Mahaprabhu in his teachings to Sri Rupa with the analogy of a creeper. So here's a very well-known analogy, which, surprise, surprise, illuminates this exact same essential point. While wandering, I'll just read the translation, I think people are well acquainted with these payars. While wandering throughout the universe, some fortunate jiva, by the grace of Guru and Krishna, receives the seed of the creeper of bhakti. Becoming a gardener, one sows the seed of that creeper in one's heart, and sprinkles it with the waters of hearing and praising, meaning engagement in forms of sadhana bhakti beginning with hearing. The creeper sprouts and grows. It pierces out of the universe and goes on. It pierces through the Viraja and Brahmaloka and reaches Parabhyoma. Then it goes above that to Goloka Vrindavan and climbs into the desired tree of Krishna's feet. There it becomes expanded and produces the fruit of prema. Here, meaning in the heart all the while, the gardener continuously sprinkles the water of hearing and so forth. Okay, sounds great. If, however, sub-branches arise on the body of the creeper, so this is a phrase, upashaka. So the word shaka means a branch. So upashaka means a sub-branch or a contrary branch. So if sub-branches arise on the body of the creeper, that is, all sorts of desires for worldly enjoyment and mukti. Okay, so what are the sub-branches? What are the things that grow up in the bhakti lata which one doesn't want? What is he framing them all as? Types of desires. He's not just saying behaviors, he's saying desires, because behaviors are the outcome of desires. So the real thing is the desires. So the list of which is endless, that is sub-branches like forbidden behavior, quibbling, harming living beings, desire for profit, desire for prestige, etc. Then these sub-branches take in the sprinkled water, that is the water sprinkled on the creeper by practices of bhakti, and grow. And the main branch thus becomes stunted and cannot grow, because the resources meant for it are usurped by the sub-branches. Therefore, from the start, one must cut away any sub-branches. Then the main branch will grow and go to Vrindavan. Then the fruit of prema ripens and falls, and the gardener tastes it. This is the ultimate attainment, the ultimate purushartha, in comparison to which the four purusharthas are like straw. In this way, prema becomes manifest from pure bhakti. So if I may, I'll offer a little bit of an extension of this analogy from my childhood. I grew up in a town, and the biggest festival that was held in the town every year was called the Pumpkin Festival. And every year in autumn, there was this big weekend where they would close down the whole downtown, and there would be a big, like what's equivalent in India to like a mela. And vendors and musicians and cooking and all the types of things would happen, and thousands of people would come from all the nearby areas, and it was a big deal. So in this pumpkin festival, they would have a pumpkin growing contest, and there was a lot of pumpkin cultivation in the area, and so all the local farmers would all compete every year by trying to grow a giant pumpkin. And so on one of the days of this festival, these farmers would come in with their trucks and bring out these massive pumpkins, and then they would weigh them in front of a crowd, and whoever's pumpkin weighed the most got a prize. And they would have pumpkins that weighed 300-400 kgs, like these that took multiple people on a pallet to get off the truck and all of this. So anyway, this is some experience I can remember watching the pumpkin weigh-off when I was a kid and being amazed at these giant pumpkins. So the reason I tell this whole background is that suppose you're that farmer trying to grow the giant pumpkin. Then that pumpkin is going to grow on a particular shoot coming from the base of the plant. So when you're trying to grow this massive pumpkin, you want all the nutrients, all the resources that are going into that pumpkin, into that plant rather, to go to that main pumpkin. So suppose some other pumpkins or other branches started coming up on that plant, what would you do? You would trim them away so that the energy and the nutrients going into the plant don't go into these other branches or these other pumpkins. You want maximum feeding of the main pumpkin so that you can grow the biggest pumpkin there is. So maybe this is so simple, it's like, why are you even saying this? But this is the idea of the analogy, is that the bhakti lata is producing this fruit called prem. So in my analogy, prem is like the giant pumpkin. So you want to make the giant pumpkin, you want to make the prem fruit, so you have to trim off all the other branches. You have to prevent all the resources going into the plant from going off into the other branches or off into other fruits, and such that they only nourish and they only lead to the fruition and the greatness, if you will, of the main fruit. So this is the principle. With respect to the analogy given in this passage, Srimad Mahaprabhu's prayer in the verse under discussion can be compared to a pruning knife. Now I'm adding to the analogy here. So when you prune maybe if you prune a pumpkin, you could use anything. If you prune a tree, typically they have some, clippers that are useful for that. So when you come in to prune your bhakti lata, in other words, when you introspect within yourself, then this principle of Mahaprabhu that I want Ahaituki-bhakti, I don't want this, and this, can be something like a knife or a tool that you can then use to come in, analyze your plant, and say, okay, look, here's my main desire, here's these other desires. Okay, and what do I want? I want this and not that. Okay. So, just as a person pruning their trees comes and, trims off all the small shoots so that the canopy gets plenty of sunlight, so that the fruits that grow near the trunk of the tree get enough sunlight to become ripe. Similarly, by trimming off all these other sub-branches, then you can ensure that the energy that comes to nourish the plant goes to the main goal. So this principle, this type of prayer, this type of introspection is like the tool or the knife by which one can do this pruning of the bhakti lata. So Srimad Mahaprabhu's prayer in the verse under discussion can be compared to a pruning knife that can be used to trim sub-branches off of the creeper of bhakti. Be they grossly divergent from bhakti, as in the case of what Sri Chakravarti Pad calls detriments arising from offenses, or anartutta aparad, aparadutta anartas. So he gives 4 categories of anartas, so I've listed those here. Quote, moderately divergent from bhakti, as in the case of what Sri Chakravarti Pad calls detriments arising from misdeeds, dushkritota anartas, such as various forms of worldly attachment, enmity, and contrary absorption, and detriments arising from good deeds, sukritota, such as various forms of absorption and worldly enjoyment. Or 3, subtly divergent from bhakti, as in the case of what Sri Chakravarti calls detriments arising from bhakti itself, bhakti-yukta anarthas, which could sound like a contradiction. How could bhakti produce anarthas? What's unwholesome about bhakti? So nothing unwholesome about bhakti, but some of the byproducts of the presence of bhakti lead to anarthas for those who still suffer from attachment to those things that are produced by the presence of bhakti. So it's not bhakti itself that's actually causing the anarthas, but it's instrumental in those coming about, so to speak. So Chakravarti comments on this as follows, and this whole analysis is from the Rasika-rangada-tika. Also, those detriments arising from bhakti, the attainment of wealth and so on, receiving adoration, gaining prestige, and so forth, specifically because of bhakti, are like sub-branches from the main branch of a creeper, as they taint even the mind of a sadhaka with their own modes of being, and with their own growth cause constriction even of bhakti, the main branch of the creeper from which they grow. So for example, if someone deeply absorbs themselves in some type of sadhana, then people might think, oh, this person is always busy meditating, they must be some great person, and then soon enough, crowds are always coming around the person. We see this historically in India so much. So that person's absorption in their bhakti practice has produced this anartha, or this obstacle to their own absorption in the form of fame, or in the form of recognition as being someone who spends their time absorbed. So when that happens, then it's saying that anartha can cause the constriction even of bhakti. In other words, bhakti produced this fame, then the fame starts coming and then distracting you from doing more bhakti. People are constantly knocking and coming around and saying, hey, answer this, answer that, I want this, I want that, blah, 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 blah. So when this happens, then the person has to, further make an adjustment such that their own absorption, their own engagement in bhakti won't be hampered by the recognition that their existing absorption has produced. So Chakravarti the reason I just quote this here is because specifically in Madhurya Kandambani, he uses the exact same bhakti lata analogy to articulate this problem. So it's on theme in that sense. So the implied and figurative process of pruning, so this is where we get to the full ultimate practical import of what we're trying to do, is the implied and figurative process of pruning these sub-branches entails introspecting upon the state of one's own psyche, recognizing the presence of inclinations, meaning vasanas, and desires for objects other than pure bhakti, be they of whatever type, and cutting those desires away, ideally, quote, from the start. This is the word used in the Payar from the Charitamrita, pratameyi, as Sriman Mahaprabhu advises. In other words, before you act on them or before you allow them to become big, when they're still small or when they initially arise, at that point, one should try to preempt them from becoming more prominent. So how so? By returning one's attention to Bhagavan and Bhakti when they arise, reasserting internally one's resolve to devote oneself to the path of pure Bhakti, deliberating on the nature, source, influence, and potential outcome of the desire, if doing so feels warranted or can lead to greater learning, and patiently allowing the desire to pass away from the mind. So sometimes, desires or thoughts are compared to clouds in the sky. They blow in and they blow out eventually. Nothing stays permanently. So while it's there, it might be unpleasant, but if one has the ability to, remove it, let it be removed, or if one doesn't, then let it remain, but nevertheless don't act on it, or don't let oneself act on it, at least not to an excessive degree, but try to learn to have the capacity to exist with it and maintain a state, or at least a partial state of detachment from it. And this can lead to the gradual diminishing, the lack of nourishing and further fostering those things. And if side by side one is hearing, chanting, watering the bhakti lata, in other words, deepening the bhakti samskar at the same time, then by constantly nourishing the bhakti samskar and not thinking and acting or contemplating in things in such a way that leads to the exacerbation of those unfavorable samskars, then gradually there'll be a reattunement, a realignment, if you will, of the conditioning of the psyche. Should the desire remain prolongedly, or again spring up from an underlying inclination, just as new shoots often spring out from the main stalk of a creeper, then again one can patiently repeat the process. So in other words, you might do this once and then think, okay, it's gone, but then it comes back, and it might happen again and again and again. So are you necessarily doing something wrong? No. Rather, one can patiently repeat the process in a spirit of humility, repentance, eagerness to learn, readiness to self-adjust, and faith in the often gradual but inevitable triumphant power of bhakti and Sri Bhagavan to purify the heart of one who has taken shelter in them with the aspiration to be a pure bhakta. So as we mentioned, there's this verse in the 11th canto in one of the recent discussions where Padyamanopi mad bhakto navi bhuyate, where Bhagavan says, my bhakta might be obstructed, but won't be defeated. So there, these desires may arise, they may distract the person may even acquiesce to them and act on them to some extent, but if they are concerted in their effort, if they are steady in their practice to the best of their ability, gradually they will overcome. This fundamental faith is the base strength that one will have to succeed in this process. And, so what else is required? Patience, humility, repentance, a readiness to further adjust oneself, and it's found how one can improve the process. All of these things. These things could be elaborated in great detail. I'm just giving kind of a compressed overview of this process of interwork, which is, something that is both useful to articulate as well as mainly something to gradually work on and find the way, so to speak, within oneself. Along with the resolve and prayer stated in the verse under discussion, as an ideal instrument for this internal practice. The content in many of the expressions of humility presented by Sri Rupa in the earlier section of this subject, starting from verse 59 here in Padyavali, are also apt in this context, as are a number of important teachings given by Bhagavan Sri Krishna and others in Srimad Bhagavatam that were discussed in the commentaries on these aforecited expressions of humility, such as the following. And sorry, I just quoted this because I had mentioned it before, but now I have it here in the text. So, Bhadyamanopi mad bhakto vishayir ajitindriya praya pragalbaya bhaktya vishayir nabi bhuyate. Although obstructed by objects of the senses, that is, by desires and inclinations for such objects, a bhakt of mine who has not yet conquered the senses is generally not overwhelmed by objects of the senses by virtue of vigorous bhakti. That is, by virtue of bhakti which possesses the capability to overcome these obstructing influences. Sri Chakravarti Pad conceives of this struggle sadhakas undergo with residual desires and inclinations that are unfavorable for bhakti as follows. even in the condition of a bhakta's being obstructed by objects of the senses, meaning by desires and inclinations for such objects, because actually objects don't do anything. It's only the way that we perceive them and the way our psyche is attuned that is the problem. Shukadev Goswami, he's walking around, he's not disturbed by who's bathing at the river or whatever. He's not disturbed by anything. So it's not actually the objects, but it's the samskaras that we have related to those objects, which is actually the problem. So that's why I add this bracketed point, that even though one is, quote, obstructed by objects of the senses, non-obstruction by objects of the senses actually transpires by virtue of the presence of bhakti. Just as even someone who has sustained some weapon wounds inflicted by enemies in a battle is not defeated by virtue of the presence of one's bravery. That is because the warrior endures the wounds inflicted on them and continues fighting. So this is a good point. In other words, we can't complain and we can't say, oh, it's too hard, and we just give up. We have to have bravery, we have to have courage, we have to have faith, we have to keep trying, we have to persevere in the midst of whatever unfavorable mental conditioning we may have, whatever it may be. Obviously, if we expect too much too soon, we may burn out, so we have to be realistic and gradual, but nevertheless firm and efficient as far as possible in our ongoing daily practice and this inner work that's being alluded to here. The sense here is that a bhakta will sustain the faith that by virtue of the purifying power of the bhakti they are practicing, they will not ultimately be overcome by the influence of unfavorable desires and inclinations, even if they struggle with them at present or for a prolonged period of time. Rather, they will remain patient, confident, and hopeful that in due time their psyche will become purified by the power of bhakti as they strive to sustain their practice and trust in the grace of Sri Bhagavan. Sri Chakravarti Pad thus offers a second analogy in this regard. So same commentary. He says, alternately, in other words, there's the warrior fighting even though he's wounded analogy. Now he gives another analogy. On the day of taking medicine to cure yellow fever, although the fever is present, and although one is obstructed, that is, disturbed by it, or in other words, you still feel sick, you're still feeling the effect of the fever, but you've taken the medicine. He says, one is actually unobstructed by it because of it now being in the state of being subject to destruction. So since one has taken the medicine to cure it, and because of its being certain to be fully destroyed on the following day, since sufficient time will have elapsed by then for the effect of the medicine to take place. So he's saying, even though you're still sick, if you've taken the medicine that has the power to cure the ailment, then it's just a matter of time. Tomorrow morning you'll wake up and you'll be fine. So that previous day, while you're still sick, you can have the confidence that, yes, I feel sick now, but the medicine is at work, and soon enough, I will be cured by it. Soon enough, I will feel well. Soon enough, I will be free from this disease. So that's a way of illustrating this faith that, yes, right now, I'm suffering from my material conditioning. But I have faith that by taking this medicine, by doing this sadhana, that soon, inevitably in time, this will cure the ailment that I suffer with, the objects that I'm struggling with. His intention here is that a bhakta will sustain the hope and confidence that the unfavorable desires and inclinations in their psyche are certain to inevitably be purged. And thus they need only continue to humbly and steadily continue, there's a double continue, to dedicate themselves to their bhakti sadhana, as Sri Jiva Pad has also described. Jiva Gosvami, he comments on this same verse in his Krama Sandarbha. He says, a bhakta is generally not overwhelmed by objects of the senses, even when obstructed by them, because of the touch of one's expressions of humility upon Sri Bhagavan by virtue of vigorous, that is, capably powerful bhakti constituted only of sharanagati. So this is a grand statement, a very, very important statement. And one way I've explained this in the past is using an analogy with a martial art like jiu-jitsu or aikido. From what I understand, I've never practiced these, but from what I understand of the theory, when an opponent attacks you, you don't try to exert force that's greater over the force that the opponent is putting on you, but rather you sort of accept or move with the force that the opponent is bringing upon you, and then redirect that force back upon the opponent. So in other words, you don't try to directly overpower them, but you try to use their own power back upon them. So something like that, this idea that when someone is obstructed or when someone is going through struggles in their process, that one can, so to speak, redirect that energy that is coming at one from that obstacle into an expression of humility. And that humility is itself an expression of bhakti. And so even the struggle that one has with the obstacle becomes an impetus to engage in what leads to overcoming the obstacle. In other words, to engage further in an act of bhakti, which can assist in purifying oneself of the desire that is the cause of that object being an obstacle to oneself. So in that way, bhakti can be conceived as capable of overcoming these things, because bhakti has this ability to redirect or to repurpose the disturbing element into an element that can lead to the benefit of the jiva that it is working over or present within. And then also Jiva Gosvami is adding here that this expression of humility is constituted only of sharanagati. In other words, that sharanagati, the principal lakshana, is to embrace Bhagavan as one's guardian, based on having faith in him as one's guardian. So if one is going through struggles, then even just to, in humility, turn to Bhagavan for protection, that itself is a way of expressing sharanagati or sharanatmika bhakti, bhakti in the form of an expression of sharanagati. And thus, that struggle can then inspire this appeal to Bhagavan for shelter or for protection out of the humility that one feels, or the inability or lowliness that one feels to directly overcome that obstacle by their own strength. So when one has that sense of humility, and that leads to a sense of trusting in and turning to the shelter of Bhagavan, then that act of consciously remembering Bhagavan, turning to Bhagavan, was ultimately prompted by an obstacle that was disturbing someone, so that obstacle is repurposed into an impetus for bhakti. So this is an extremely valuable principle as far as how to manage one's own mind, so to speak, or how to deal with the struggles that one faces within the psyche in terms of seeking to focus the mind upon the name of Bhagavan or the Leela of Bhagavan or other ways in which the mind is engaged in bhakti, and how to respond when that's found to be difficult. Okay, I just realized I'm way over the 1 hour mark, pardon me for that. But I'll just finish this last paragraph, which concludes the discussion of this commentaries on this verse of the Bhagavatam, and then I'll stop for today. So the import of Sri Jivapad's description here is that when one is a bhakta and dedicated to the limb of bhakti known as sharanagati, that is, the practice of taking shelter in Sri Bhagavan by accepting him as one's guardian and considering oneself to belong to him, one will respond to obstructions from unfavorable desires and inclinations with humility, and one's expressions of such humility will touch Bhagavan's heart. This will thus in effect convert such obstructions into impetuses for and expressions of bhakti. In this way, bhakti remains, quote, vigorous, even in the midst of such obstructions, meaning it remains capable of carrying one through and beyond the influence of those unfavorabilities. So, I'll conclude here, the point being that, sadhana is that the aim of which is bhav. Bhav is the state of desiring only Bhagavan. Mahaprabhu is praying in our verse of discussion, I want ahaituki-bhakti and nothing else. So when we confront all the other desires in the mind, then if we can respond to them through this process of sharanagati with this quality of humility, and thereby we can succeed in pruning the bhakti lata and the flourishing of that desire for Bhagavan alone. So, I conclude here. Yes, I see a hand. Please, go ahead.
I hope it's my hand.
Yes.
Pranam. Thank you so much. It's a very nice presentation again.
Thank you.
What comes to mind is the beginning of the second canto. Parikshit Maharaj is asking the question, what causes people to commit sinful activities? And the answer was very nice that Sri Goswami gave, is that Harikatha is the one that makes people seduce their the material desires of kama. And then Bhagavatam was spoken. So what I'm trying to highlight is that often of course, the path of Bhakti sadhana is both. It consisting of this positive engagement by Harikatha and also this negative self-controlled, self-composure, being cautious, and very thoughtful about one's activities. But I would, personally, I would just stress more on Harikatha as the main purifying factor. Because the fact that really our, like you mentioned in the class, in last time class also you mentioned, like in the siddhānta-granthas, that, according to this verse, what one should do if this material desires just keep popping up in one is deplorable condition. You cannot handle it, And our advice is just continue, again, Harikatha, the Bhakti itself is purifying factor of, despite all those conditions one may have. But what type of Harikatha? That's another question, right? and my limited understanding leads me to moment. To basically listen to katha that is filled with rasa, which is pleasurable for us to hear, for any embodied living jivas to hear, because we're conditioned to pleasure, we're conditioned to enjoy, we're conditioned to beauty, we're conditioned to absorb ourselves in fascinating things. So I would, if you correct me please, but I would, if I would build my sadhana, if I have like unlimited time in my life, I would just focus mainly on Ilakatha. That's my 3 points. Not in sense.
Oh, nice. I mean, thank you for sharing. As we heard in the, in the Bhakti Lata analogy, there's the watering of the plant by the hearing, by the hearing of the katha, the nourishment. That obviously is principle. And some pruning, some trimming is also there. Two sides of the coin are both mentioned, and no doubt a good, solid, nourishing dose is is joyful and enriching, and very much to the heart and to the spirit of the whole tradition, and what we see in Mahaprabhu's own Leela and what we hear about in the lives of so many Mahatmas. So absolutely, we're all for that.
Yeah, thank you.
And as we dive further into Padyavali, we'll get much good content in this respect. Here in the early section, there's these many general topics, humility and prayers and things like that, but the last 2/3 or almost 3/4 of the book is all principally poetry about Radha Krishna Lila and many of the very charming, enriching features of that Lila, which are greatly nourishing of our aspirations for service therein. So, as far as our discussions here and the text that we're studying, we're definitely en route, so to speak. But it's also interesting that Rupa Goswami lays a lot of these, you might say more general or fundamental things down first. In other words, he covers the glories of the name and the importance of humility and prayers, and he has all this in place, and then it's sort of the implication to me of the structure of the book is, with these general things in place, now go into all of these rich, beautiful depictions and relishing of that cherished, aspired for domain.
So as the text goes on, it will be more towards this Viracandra, right?
Definitely.
Excellent presentation today, Baba. Thank you so much.
Cheers. All right, well, we can conclude here for today, and if we're so blessed, we'll continue again further in our next section. I went pretty in detail on this verse, but I thought it was well worth it, and we'll have some more on this same topic, getting into some more of the nitty-gritty of desires and their role in our sadhana and how they're, looked at and considered. And in the next time, in particular, we'll tie this into what's called the tat-kratu nyaya, or the principle of intention, that what you intend and what you desire is ultimately what you become. And so, as this verse as much emphasizes what not to desire, it's also showing what you should desire. So the significance of fostering that positive side of desire will also be where the conversation goes next, so to speak. So, Vaishnavebhyo Namo Nama. Jai Shri Guru, Jai Shri Gaur, Jai Jai Radhe Shyam.
Jai Shri Radhe Shyam.